Hello everyone, and once again, welcome to Mitchell Giddings Fine Arts. Thank you for spending this beautiful evening in the gallery with our artists, and we're especially grateful to Eric Boyer, who flew all the way from Portland, Oregon to share his art and his thoughts with us. And many of you here tonight, and several others who attended our opening on Thursday, are old acquaintances of Eric's, who lived in Windham County from 1977 to 2002. He and I shared life drawing classes in the mid-'80s. Petey was also a friend, and who could have imagined that Petey and I would be hosting his sculpture 30 years later in a gallery with our names on it. With his chosen medium of wire mesh, Eric fashions beautiful figurative or geometric shapes, which in turn may be echoed by their shadows on the wall. So ironically, his drawings are created by the sculpture itself, and we're left to marvel not only at their subtle beauty, but at the interplay of solid and surface, of lines and forms, and light and movement. Once again, we thank Andy Reichsman and Kate Purdy of Ames Hill Productions and Brattleboro Community Television for videotaping and airing this event. Also, please visit our link with the Vermont Arts Council and their art calendar. So remember to support your local artists, enjoy the exhibit, get some questions ready, and please help me welcome Eric Boyer.
Hi, everybody. Am I on? Well, that was fabulous. I don't have anything nearly as rehearsed or written, so when I digress or go off on too tangential of a thread, just, you know, people can be asking me questions and it'll kind of keep me on track. But thanks, everybody. Thanks, Petey and Jim, for so enthusiastically welcoming me here. I mean, I always wanted to show in Brattleboro, and I always felt like there really wasn't quite the right place. And, you know, all due praises to Gallery North Star. I showed there for many, many years, really right after I got out of the gate with making wire mesh sculpture. But it was always just within the realm of exclusivity, and I couldn't show in Brattleboro, and whenever I would do it, I'd get in trouble. And it's finally just, you know, taken all these years, and I finally am able to show here with old friends. It's just fantastic. So thank you guys for creating this fantastic space, and I don't know, it makes me feel like a rock star. I don't act like it, but I try not to act like it. Well, I thought I'd give a brief introduction because I kind of know, you know, more than half of you, and you kind of know where I've come from, but just to kind of go back through, and then I can continue, and then at some point talk about what the art means, and then take questions from people, and you know, I think we could use up plenty of time that way, and you'll all leave with a lot of information about what this is about. But I did start, if I start way back, my dad was a elementary school, public school art teacher, and he just was a very generous person with his time and just would lavish kind of borrowed art supplies from the school on us, and we'd play these great games, and it was like a little family parlor game where we'd play games like 5 lines, and we'd scribble lines and pass it to the next sibling and say, you know, turn that into an elephant or something like that. And really it was just kind of like about, you know, creativity was fun. It didn't really have to be about anything. It was more like taking something you've got, like you're on a family camping trip and you go to the coast and there's driftwood, and let's just stack it up and make something cool. And that's sort of just been where I've always wanted to go with this. When I moved here, so I went to Windham College for a brief time when it was still, it had already kind of closed and then reopened, and I was there for a year and a half while it was open, and then it closed again for real. I just kind of, with a few little exceptions, I stuck around the neighborhood and lived between here and Putney and Westminster West, and I wasn't really, I was more like looking for something, I don't know, that was more kind of like homesteady or like farm kind of oriented, but somehow I kept doing these creative things, whether it was music or art or ceramics or printmaking or something or other, while I was, you know, painting houses to pay the bills or one thing after another. And it's just interesting how it evolved. And I really feel like this was an amazingly supportive community to really grow up into adulthood, so to speak, if I can be so generous with myself. But, you know, every time I would do something, I'd feel like there was this community supporting me and going, oh, that's really cool. But I tried so many different things that the one critique I would typically get was, why don't you stick with one thing and, you know, get good at it? And I really realized that, okay, I'm not doing that. I'm just like going off on another tangent, trying another thing. And it took me, I had a lot of interest in sort of, I don't know if you'd call it frontier arts or like homesteading skills. And I liked building stone walls, and I liked the idea, if not the expertise of post and beam building and things like that, that really harkened way back. And they also applied pretty well to Vermont living. You know, you always have to fix things, and you kind of scavenge things, and you salvage things, and you, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of attitude. And so there was this job opening at West Village Forge, and I thought, boy, doing wrought iron would be right up this alley, and I'm really excited about that. And they had heard, Lee Morrell had heard through the grapevine that I had done some kind of project with Dan Snow doing stone masonry, and which is really it was just a one-time project, but it kind of got me in the door at the forge at, you know, $4 an hour, and I started doing wrought iron. But the thing is, this was in the 80s, wrought iron was going through this renaissance that, and if our friend Kevin was here, he would concur. It just was a very exciting time to be doing wrought iron, because there were traditionalists, there were engineers, there were physicists, people who worked at Sandia Labs and Los Alamos, and there were also just like hippie, you know, people living on a homestead, and there were fine artists, and all these people were using blacksmithing and welding and steel and iron and in so many different ways. Jewelers, you know, I could go on, but it really felt like we were part of this exciting thing, and it was almost expected that you'd go through this kind of training, and then you'd find your own niche and just launch off in some other direction. And I kind of feel like we did that to some degree, and for me, that happened to be fireplace screen. We were fabricating fireplace screens for people's country homes all the time, and you know, typically it was just kind of a flat screen or a bow front screen with a riveted, welded, you know, forge-handled sort of a surround frame to it, maybe little legs. Sometimes they had hinges, you know, there'd be variations. But the one thing we really didn't ever do was sculpt the screen, the mesh. And if anything, there'd be dimples and wrinkles in it that we had to take out and try to, you know, how do you get that perfectly straight? And if you look at it from the edge, you still see the ripple, and we were trying to get these things out all the time. And I kind of let myself go, what about if it ripples so easily, maybe I should try rippling it more. And I was like, that's kind of cool. And like, let's curl it around. And we're always trimming little bits, like a 1-inch strip off an edge, because the roll was 36 inches, but the screen we're making is 34 inches. And so there were strips that obviously we're never going to use for anything else. And so I'd kind of pull them out of the scrap bin. We're not going to redeem them for very much money if we go and melt it all down. So even just like making a little spiral out of mesh and then pulling it and twisting it, or making a cylinder, and just playing around at lunchtime, I realized how much fun it was. And I'd get larger and larger scraps to play with, and I'd make some little figures, and I kind of always been drawn to the figure. I like to make this comparison between when I was a kid and I'd play around and doodle. I'd be doodling sort of muscly monsters, but I'd also doodle muscle cars. I don't know, there's something about I don't know, it's a coming of age kind of ritual for me, but, you know, or maybe a muscle car turning into a muscly monster with veins and, you know, like bullets spraying out of their eyeballs or whatever, you know, like what teenage boys do. And and that's an example of me losing the thread because I forget what I was going to say, but I guess I was kind of familiar with drawing the figure, and it wasn't from life, and it wasn't anything other than being influenced by the bubblegum cards with hot rods on them with people with eyeballs and tongues hanging out, and, you know, just influenced by all the typical like little kid 70s muscle car silly stuff. But because I liked doing figures and this wire mesh was so good at taking all these forms, I just kind of evolved into starting to do figures, and I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Made a few of them, people kind of liked them. And then I'm still working at West Village Forge, and it's, I guess, 1989. Harold Makepeace, as many of you remember well, and may he rest in peace, but I haven't seen him for a really, really long time, and I know he's passed, but he was curating Art on the Mountain. And he would come in the forge and he'd be all excited about these sweaty, muscly guys that were working there all the time. But he just said, I want some of these wire mesh figures and I want them at Art on the Mountain. And so so I didn't have to apply to my very first exhibition. So just lucky me, as usual. Didn't do really anything to deserve that. But then I show it, and as I show up to Art on the Mountain, the first two pieces I've ever done that are kind of life-size-ish, like, you know, this kind of scale, they're already sold when I show up. And I just go, bye-bye West Village Forge. Now I'm a sculptor. So that's kind of what it took for me. I usually don't go into things saying, like, I'm going to plan my life and I'm going to work at a forge and learn how to do wire mesh sculpture, and then I'll evolve from there. It's just kind of like, here's this opportunity, and away I go. And really, it's just been kind of a nonstop ride from there. A bit of a roller coaster, but those were the proto days of, you know, having everything be new and exciting. And so the best I could do, sorry I'm sweating like crazy, but it's a little bit humid and warm here. I'm not nervous at all, but I'm sweating. But if you don't mind, I don't mind. It might not look that great on film. When I sat down to write the artist statement, and I always just get, you know, the expectation of what am I going to write about? It's just, you know, overwhelming, and I'm not good enough to come up with a thing to say. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. Of course I know what to say. I just have to not say what I think other people think I should be saying. I just have to say what I actually say. And it's basically like, all this work is just me kind of playing around with something and going, hey, look what happened. Oh, it's pretty good. If I refine it, I can show it to, people like it. You know, it's just this kind of innocent, I mean, it's almost superficial in that it's not really thought out in advance. It's just about like tactile experience with a material that happens to be amazing to work with. And of course I, you know, infuse into it or imbue it with where I'm already coming from, some of which history I'm describing, like just simple creative games with my dad and my siblings, or an interest in, you know, like science that makes me want to create organic forms, or even an interest in science and like, not really optics, but like just wanting art to be an experience where you don't have to read the blurb to understand what it's about. You just see it, and then you want to know, you know, how does that happen, or I'm just enjoying the experience I'm having. So whenever I'm creating, it's really just to try something and then see if it's having that effect. And I don't really always know from my own perceptions whether it's having that effect. Sometimes it's like a full body goosebump experience, and then I say, yeah, this is, I don't care if, what people say, this is happening. But other times I really don't know. Like there'll be certain pieces that I don't think are terribly successful, but other people think that they are, and then vice versa. So it's just always that interesting evolution, just putting things out there and saying, what do you think about this? So with my artist statement, I was basically coming down to, it's really kind of like I've got these preconceived rules, and they're not even societal rules or anything that anybody's given me. It's just that I've kind of created these rules for myself, and I haven't done it consciously. So there's self-imposed subconscious rules, and if I can just reveal what they are, like in the process of creating, I go, oh, I get, it's kind of binary. You're always making these decisions, like this way, that way, and it's getting ridiculous, isn't it? But so it's the roar of the grease paint and the smell of the crowd or whatever. So, you make these decisions and you realize the reason you're making the decisions is you've got these rules that are like, well, I can't do it that way, I have to do it this way. And they've really, my own rules have really limited me. They've allowed me to do a lot, but then at some point they just haven't served me. And one of the things was because I was doing figures and because I was doing these kind of like classical or very representational figures, I just didn't think that I had a vision that would allow me to do abstract sculpture. But I was constantly experimenting with the material, and in the process of experimenting with the material, I would come up with some kind of effect that I thought, well, how would I translate this into a figure? And at some point I said, I don't have to turn it into a figure. I can just, these vessels, for example, they can just be cylinders that just hang there in the light and they just do their thing, and they're not representational, they're not anything, they're not even conceptual, they're just what they are. So, so that's my theme. Break your own rules if they're not serving you, and try to stay present and see what it is that we're actually creating. And I don't know, I can talk forever, but I would appreciate questions because otherwise I'll just blab like this forever. But John started, but then
Yeah, I heard it.
I saw you up there kind of squirming, so I figured I would lob a question at you.
Oh, I'll squirm more. But yeah, go. Feel free.
So I'm just looking around the room as you're talking, and when you left, you didn't have red in your work, so I'm wondering where the red came from.
Well, to backtrack just a little bit, the black is kind of like, it's almost like one of those rules. Like working at a blacksmith shop, mostly what we did was black hammered iron, and sometimes we'd do a rust finish with some linseed oil or something, but it was pretty much like this kind of monochromatic, old-fashioned, iron work. And we really didn't do much, if any, bright colored anything. And so when I started using the wire mesh, before I discovered powder coating, which is this hard finish that's on virtually all of these pieces, I was just taking the iron mesh and just kind of like burning the oil off of it and then putting some linseed oil on it. So it was kind of like I'm still doing a fireplace screen, except now it's a figure. And then years later, after doing this for years, I discovered powder coating, but I was still really just doing black because kind of black is like what you do with woven wire mesh. It really wasn't until I started doing the abstract pieces that I thought, the black, I can't just go forever doing black. And so even though when you look around, you'd think, okay, red is the one other color I'd use, but it's remarkable to me that of the many colors I've tried to use, most of them just don't seem to translate right with the wire mesh and just the combination of light and and the overlapping and the interesting kind of highlights and shadows you get when you've got hundreds and hundreds of little bits of wire. So for example, like a yellow or a white look really strange to me. And so I just, I've tried it and I don't want to do that. But there's darker and bolder colors. And like for me, the patina, there's a wide range of metallic patinas that I can use, and many of them seem to work. There's a pretty broad range from like browns to blues and greens, but then there's certain blues or greens that just don't work for me at all. And the red is one of those things I feel like has just pretty consistently worked. But even then, there's some pieces, maybe not here, but there's some pieces that I've done in red, and then, I don't know, I kind of think maybe the urchin over there had been red, and I just said, no, that one's not working in red. So I do have the option of using some spray paint on the powder coating after the fact, but the best, the best finish is just that simple powder coated finish. It solidifies the piece, and it kind of thickens the wire up a little bit, and when you multiply it by that many strands of wire, it really, the piece becomes a little bit bigger and a little bit more visible. Interestingly enough, I used to, whenever I would think of abstract art, I'd think of people who just do like giant red I-beams out in the field, sort of like not the Chuck Ginniver look, but maybe like the worst Chuck Ginniver sculpture. I thought, I can never do that. I can't possibly do that. But when I found myself doing hand sculpted wire mesh and then doing it in red, I thought, well, the red part I could do. I just can't do the I-beam red in the field. But maybe that answers the question about the red. And Rick.
I like this it becomes more solid, this blue. Like,
oh yeah.
None of the others are kind of like that.
I was thinking this is an interesting piece because that's a pretty old piece, but that's one of those ones that I experimented with. I think because I was using this patina, and it's a water-based paint that contains metallic particles, and I just kept painting it on, and there's a phenomenon with the mesh where when you really sculpt it, there's open parts of the grid and then there's some parts that are really compressed, and it's hard to paint on that without it just gumming over. So in this case I thought, well, what the heck, I'll just keep painting it and it'll just gum over the whole thing. And then I patinaed it, and it was already interestingly not one of my typical figures, so it's kind of already got that abstract thing, and it's almost like there's this organic thing that grew out of the ground like that, and it's it's like one of these headless torsos, but it's just open at the top, and then it's got some little abstract swirls going around, but then it's also painted over, and so it kind of combines a bunch of things that I ended up exploring a little bit more when I started doing more abstract work. But I didn't know, I really liked when I took the inventory from Gallery North Star and brought it here, I thought that piece is kind of like more like what I'm doing now, or even more so because it represents this missing link between the figurative pieces and the abstract pieces.
That was actually my question. I was wondering about that piece to your right there with the classical figure, and then it goes into this head that's completely kind of fairy-like or something, whimsical. Yeah. And this piece is kind of like that whimsical look, whereas I don't see anything that's quite like that.
And this is an older piece too.
How you went into that progression of thought.
Well, there's so many, I think, the best way I can think to describe that, maybe it doesn't address the head of this particular piece, but it's, whenever there'd be leftover mesh, I thought, I don't know, it's sort of like it's not a work ethic thing, but it's sort of like a work ethic based guilt about doing, having, like I couldn't ever just show just a flat piece of mesh, even though that might be visually really interesting. To me, it would be like, well, I didn't do anything to it. I can't just hang that up. But so I'd always have to be overworking every little thing, and I'm trying to still, that's another rule, I don't really have to overwork every little bit. I can leave things just plain off to the side. So many of these pieces that you see where there's like a background, it's been worked, but I'm trying to do it less and less, and I find that actually, sort of like the way the vessels are, the simple forms actually have this visual interest much more than the wrinkly background. So it's counterproductive for me to work it more, even though there's this work ethic saying like you have to work harder to get something. You know, so it's kind of like that's the progression, is I'm going from the over wrinkly thing to the simpler thing.
And the columns are so kinetic, kind of, compared to anything else. It's interesting.
Yeah, and partially, well, they do turn, you know, on a single point of suspension, so and they're very symmetrical. So there's none of this detail to distract you from just seeing that the moire pattern's kind of going off. But I'm realizing that I still have this rule about not wrinkling up, like I feel like I should be working the material, and I'm trying to unlearn that, but on the other hand, I'm thinking I could wrinkle it more, and that would go against my rules, and I have to try that too someday. But Erin had a question.
On the subject of working the material, how, like a mechanical question, how are you actually working this mesh? And especially for a surface that's so sensitive, as you said. I mean, it's very flawless, a lot of your compositions, the way you're folding and manipulating the wire mesh. How hard is that difficult to produce without flaws? And also, how are you actually physically, are you using tools, your hands?
I use my hands as tools, like they're hammers sometimes. I mean, I'm kidding, but it's kind of, I do kind of abuse myself, and I'm always trying to unlearn that. I was realizing, as I was thinking about what this talk might be about, I thought, boy, you know, when I started doing this, the attractive thing about it was there's this simple mesh. It's already a woven mesh, so I'm just taking this industrial material and I'm just using my hands and I'm just forming it with just my hands. And then that became sort of this like shtick that, you know, there's no tools. But then I realized, like, well, you know, a screwdriver is really helpful for, you know, putting in some detail. And so then, but a regular screwdriver slips between the wires and kind of distorts it. So then because I was a blacksmith, I could just kind of forge the screwdriver out a little wider so it would span across wires. And then I'm doing that. And then, well, you know, a pair of pliers really helps too. And then I've got this little like hole punch. And the hole punch is really great for making navels and nipples and things like that. So I'm gradually doing these other tools, and I realized, like, I got to change my story now because I'm using tools, even though they're just the simplest possible hand tools. At one point, somebody was doing a video kind of like this of me, but just in the studio. And every time I'd whip out a tool, you know, he had been told I don't use tools. And I was like, oh, another tool, okay. And oxyacetylene torches, a tool. I said, well, what I mean is I don't have molds and casts, and it's just low tech. It's like a pocket full of tools. I got a little punch and a screwdriver and a pliers, and, you know, that to me, that's still no tools, but I am using things that serve me. And after that, I realized that I was putting a lot of effort into pushing up. Like I would have a work table, and I still do, and I'd be pressing down, but I have to press against something, and I would just be always pushing up from underneath and pressing down like this. And I thought, well, why do I have to use my hand that way? I could just make a tool that's a benchtop tool, and I can just press down like this with both hands. So I scavenged some things together, and you know, there's a little piece of, not a railroad track, but the plate that the track attaches to, and there was a little just piece of metal that went into the hole of that, and there were some things up at what was the place that sold wood stoves and fireplace, Friends of the Sun, right? And they had this fireplace insert that was getting scrapped, and it had these brass balls as finials. And I was like, oh, one of those things would work great. So I grabbed one of those, and I just kind of cobbed this thing together. And I still use that exact same setup. It's the same chunk of railroad track iron and the same post that I found, you know, hitchhiking along the road, and the same brass ball. But I've worn through one of the brass balls. It got so thin from me rubbing across it that it just started collapsing like tinfoil. But luckily I had a spare one, so I put that one on there. But so it's kind of evolved like that. And it's never really gone beyond that. Like, there's all this crazy stuff out there, like now with 3D printing and stuff, and I'm still just a guy, you know, with some fireplace screen going like this, and I feel like I'm potentially getting left behind in the Iron Age, but I don't really know how to make that leap because my approach is just directly, you know, grab the material and mess around with it, see what it does. So, hi Sue.
Hi Eric. I wanted to ask when you introduced light into working with these.
It's been always kind of a surprise to me. Like, I should know so much more about it. People will ask me, what do you recommend? What kind of light bulb should I use? And I seriously don't really know, but I should know. I mean, it's kind of a responsibility that I'm shirking to my galleries and my clients, but everybody else, in my experience, does a better job than me. It's sort of like I take it as far as, you know, doing a finished piece in the studio and then I hand it over, and I mean, in a way it makes sense because I can't really dictate or control or even predict what different situations these pieces are going to be in. So there's everything from daylight to hanging against a dark wall or a brick wall or, you know, incandescent or LED, you know, so I'm not going to say it needs to be such and such a thing, but it's more like, what I like is there's different situations where we discover something new, either by, like this piece, we were wondering how best to light it, and I said, well, sometimes we hang them away from the wall, and then the shadow is like a separate entity, and there's certain basic phenomena that we can predict, but I don't go out of my way to dictate it. It's more like I just say, oh, look, here's this opportunity and we can do this. It's more improvisational, which is kind of what this is like anyway. You know, there's certain known effects, but then maybe you can combine them slightly differently and come up with something new.
But I was thinking, you don't look with a light in your studio while you're working and then rework the piece, and
No.
because from here,
Yeah.
the figure behind that piece is incredible.
Yeah,
It's just by chance it came out that way.
well, it's more like there's some interesting things, like it's one of these chance phenomena. To go back to the history, which may or may not sound interesting, but I'm still working at the West Village Forge, and I think I was making my third wire mesh sculpture ever for Art on the Mountain that same year in '89, and I just thought, well, I better take a picture of this, but you know, working in the forge is just like gritty, dirty, sooty wood and iron and stacks of steel and just crappy, ugly, just messy stuff everywhere, and there's nowhere to take a picture of anything. But it was a really beautiful day with just like a bluebird sky. So I take this piece and I've got my camera in one hand and I'm holding the sculpture up, and I'm like, how can I do that? And I'm trying to take a picture, and as I'm holding it up, the sun casts a shadow on the hood of my school bus yellow Toyota Corolla beater junk mobile, and I was like, Eureka! Look at the shadow! It was just, so that's what I mean. Like, I never expected that to happen, but that happened. And some of you might remember, I had these two identical Toyota Corollas, and I'd try to fix the one that was broken, but I'd end up taking the broken part and installing it in the other. You know, I would forget which one was which because you couldn't even tell them apart. Yeah, but that was my first photo backdrop, the blue sky and then the shadow on the Toyota. But so it's just the phenomenon of, it's sort of like the 3D is just compressed down to 2D, but it doesn't matter which way it goes. Like if if I turn that, it just keeps being whatever the contour is, and that's, it's kind of like, I compare it to, you're driving down the road and you're passing a cornfield and you can only see through down the rows when you're directly in front of them. They're opaque otherwise, but so you're just seeing them as this sort of optical illusion of, this thing that's kind of swinging by you. And it's just like that with this. When you look at the the profile or contour or horizon line of it, it's completely opaque and becomes less so. So it just provides its own shading. That's one of the interesting things about lighting it, is because it doesn't really have, so with purely ambient light, it doesn't have highlights or shadows other than what your vantage point gives it. And you know, if I get all the way off to the side of it, it's pretty much all opaque because there's so many overlaps. But when you're looking straight at it, the only dark places are the outlines, and the outline, that sort of horizon line, changes as you move around it. You know, it just happens. I can't say I've learned to really master it. Sometimes I still make a piece and I go, oh, it overlaps too much, so now there's that one part of the leg that's just black, but everything else is, you know, so there's sort of this balance that you reach between what I'm trying to represent visually and then what the material is doing, sort of sneaking around behind me, doing some other thing that I wasn't anticipating. Liza.
So this led me to a technical sort of question.
Oh, okay.
Is the material forgiving? So if you have something and you know this isn't right, you can reform it.
Yeah, to a great degree. I try to, well, with almost everything, but especially with the figures, where I really am trying to achieve something that looks right, whatever that is. You know, before I'm committing to a particular fold, I'm trying to keep it open so that I can move that. It's sort of like a shallow valley, and I'll move it back and forth until I get those proportions right. But because it's sort of like, I guess, if you were making clothing patterns, and you'd have to put the whole thing together and seam it up and put it on before you really know what it looks like. And ultimately, that's kind of what it's like. I'll have this shallow valley, and I'll go, well, that's where it's going to be, like a leg here and a leg here. And I think that's about right, because it's going to be totally different when I scrunch it down like that. And so then I'll do it, and I'll go, crap, I wasn't right. But other times, it's like, okay, I just have to go with it kind of gesturally. And, you know, it can be like sketching. It's very satisfying that way, but then if there's some part of the sketch I want to undo, it's really hard to do if I've you know, committed to that degree, like where it's actually pinched down. But it's a lot more fun, because when I try to do it carefully, it's just too, you know, picky and takes too long, and it's kind of more static. So I think one of the things I'd like to bring into maybe especially my figurative sculpture is a more kind of quick gestural, sketchy kind of technique, which would just be immediately satisfying. And maybe I could just leave it that way and not just keep working and working until every little thing is perfect. And I know, like any of you who are artists know that we can really overwork our things until they just lose all their spirit. And then we go, why did I do that? I could have, you know, in the first 20 minutes, I had this gesture and this proportion, and it was just right. And then I overworked it until I, you know, don't like it anymore. But all the question people are over here. Oh, Molly, hi, Molly.
Do you envision a piece, like do you see it in your mind before you start, or does it emerge as, I mean, do you have no idea what's going to show up? Or
Well, it's a really good question, because it's one of the huge dividing lines between a lot of commissioned work where there's a presumed end goal. It's not just open-ended. It's like, I want this. And then what I like to do is go into the studio and have no idea what I'm doing, but I kind of want to try this thing, and I just try this thing and then see what happens. I mean, I vastly prefer that, just doing my own thing and discovering something. Even if it's disappointing, it's like, well, at least I went through those motions and I found out what was at the other end. But we also need to make a living, so I'll take a commission saying like somebody wants that exact thing, or can you do that exact thing but facing right, or something like. So sometimes it's very, very constrained, and sometimes, typically it won't be a commission if it's open-ended. If it's open-ended, it's just me, doing work like this to just show at a gallery. So it's kind of both. But it's almost extremes of both. Yeah, I'll rarely start my own piece just on my own volition and have a set outcome already in mind. It's like either completely open-ended, tangential, or it's like the customer wants this. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but.
I have a second part of the question. And when something emerges, does it feel like it's like some of the figurative stuff, or even the less figurative? Is it some aspect of your psyche or some mythical collective unconscious? I mean, do you feel like these pieces speak to you or some bigger thing?
I'd say especially when it's just an open-ended thing, then that whole process is like that. And it may be hard to put words to it, but like, as I was saying, I don't know if it was before you came in, that I just came up with, it's something I've said before, but it was the theme of my show or of my talk or of my artist statement is just breaking our own rules, because we have all these rules that keep us, it can keep us in what we call a style, but we maybe don't even realize what it is that's constraining us to a style. So for me, then I think of, well, what does that mean for me as a person? And it's like, that says a lot about me. Like I'm constrained by these things that I don't know if I need to be. Like, do I need to try to be a nice guy? Like, I'm not, I'm a total jerk, but people think I'm a nice, but it's like that when you make this artwork and it's like, I didn't have to do it that way. I just keep saying to myself that I have to do it that way. So it's deeply, it's almost like this spiritual thing for me, but then the end result, I'm not gonna say this is a spiritual piece of mine. It's more like my own journey was, yes, always, constantly. Whether I'm beating myself up or experiencing joy and catharsis in the studio, it's like, no matter what it is, it's a journey, and the journey is amazing. But it doesn't necessarily have that story. That's more like, that story is my autobiography, but it's not like my artist statement exactly. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know. Does that make sense? Petey?
The large pod and having to do with the figurative work, eventually the evolution into more abstract. I put those two pieces together on purpose, the piece to your absolute left and then the pod, because that just seems so, sorry to use the word, representative of the journey the morphing that you've been going through. Can you say anything about that? Or maybe you already did in a lot of different ways, but because that's so, there's such an anthropomorphic quality, physical quality to that particular piece.
Yeah, well, I do find that almost everything I make, somebody will find, even if I don't notice it, somebody will find, oh, there's figures in there too. And I think, oh, I didn't see that, but like people were seeing them in this thing. Now somebody else thought that looked like a jellyfish larva. But it was a marine biologist, and she started giving me names for all the things that I do. Like this one is one of these, and this is one of these, and it's interestingly figurative, just not human. But this, I'm trying to think, is the other pod? There's another pod. Is that somewhere else? Oh, okay. Well, because I was going to compare the two, but this was like the first big experimental pod after I did this little pod, and I just gave it the name pod. It's sort of like, I don't know what it is, but it's, you know, a pod. But I mean, it could be a lot of things like dancing figures, and I had done a little study years ago, and I just had no idea how I was ever going to recreate it. And I literally would study it and look at it and think about what it was and how many curves it had, but somehow I made it and I liked it, but I couldn't replicate it. So I just kind of went on this journey to replicate it. And I made a small one, and then when I tried to make a large one, so many things about it didn't translate. I just could not. Oh, is that the little one over there?
Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. This wasn't the original one. This was maybe one of the early small ones, but it was just a certain thing about, like, it's a ribbon of mesh with a fold in it, and I just twist it around this way, and I get it to connect back to itself. And to me, that was just like, wow, I got to do this. This is my life, my future. This is what I want to do, and it. You know, and I tried to do a large one. Well, for one thing, this is the finer mesh that I typically use for figures. And then I tried to do it with the coarser mesh. And not that, you know, to me, because I know the story of making it, it's, you know, when I see these extra seams, to me, that's like, oh, that was me failing to make the connection and having to cut it apart and then put it back together. And it was really super labor intensive. But this is one of those pieces, so it's it's along the way of making some other pieces that, who knows, maybe because they became more streamlined and neat and tidy, maybe they're not as interesting. But this was one that was supremely challenging, and, you know, this was one that was really easy. And it's funny how even if I do a series of things, it's not always that it gets easier and easier. Sometimes I'll do 3 in a row, and the third one is really hard, and I can't even figure out what that's about, because, you know, I'm literally starting with the same strip of mesh, and I'm making the same fold in it, and I'm doing it, and then something will happen, and I'm like, what just happened? But so with this one, what I see in it is all these cuts and seams. But so now when I was doing strictly figures, that wouldn't happen. I'm not going to do a figure with all these Frankenstein seams all over it unless the whole piece somehow is benefiting from those seams. But with this piece, I felt like, you know what, I'm going to actually highlight those seams, because that's now part of the composition. It almost, because I didn't set out to do it that way, they're a little bit inadvertent, but they're there, and boy, I don't want to. It's sort of like our own flaws. Like, I don't want to hide it. I'd rather go, this is what it is, and I'm going to flaunt it instead.
Yeah, when you have such a convoluted thing like that, do you have a preconceived notion of how big of an area you're going to start working with? How do you...
Well, so like, how long of a strip of mesh do you need before it goes
to get to the end result?
I think the first one I did, I analyzed it, I kind of reversed engineered it, and without taking measurements, I said, well, it's a ratio of 1 to 15. So then I thought, well, if I'm going to do one that's a foot wide, I need a 15-foot long strip, and then I'm going to put a crease down the middle, and I'm going to fold it in an S curve until the last part of the S comes back together to and it was like hugely challenging. So I tried smaller ones to kind of get my technique down first. And even though I thought I had it figured out, there's these parameters of the volume that I still hadn't figured out, because the folds themselves add material, and it kind of takes away that central space, so it's smaller. Like that whole piece, obviously, if you really crushed it down, it would take up no space at all. So there's this interesting thing about, you can have a certain amount of fabric, but it doesn't necessarily translate to a certain volume, because it could inhale or it could exhale, and but that's why I like having it just be open-ended. I'd way rather work until I feel like it's done than to be constrained by it being expected to be a certain size already. Yeah. And as long as you don't say, how long does it take you to make one?
No. I just wanted to talk about the 3 vessels, the hanging pieces, which we feel are some of the most stimulating, interesting, because you have so many different ways of experiencing mesh as a medium, that when you see the overlap, and I don't know if you call it a Rorschach test or something like that, because you see all of these negative, positive images. These 3 hanging pieces, what I'm referring to, they are so exciting that I don't know if you're going to be doing larger, smaller, sideways. I mean, long horizontals or.
Well,
They're really exciting to me visually. And of course, it's like a migraine.
All
having a migraine.
the above.
No, it's great. A good migraine.
The vessel, so the vessels are interestingly, they're one of these consistent things about an abstract version of the wire mesh, because the vessels, that what I was saying originally, I would just try to create a cylinder that I could then make a fully in the round freestanding figure from. And I did a couple figures, but I wasn't that happy with the figure because I just didn't like that seam in the middle of it. And even though I knew I could probably make it a little more abstract and you wouldn't think the seam was that weird, I just never really pursued it. But I realized that to exploit the form, the best thing to do was just make this symmetrical thing, and then you can stand them up and you can lay them down and you can hang them. But when I first suspended them and realized they would turn, and that the simplicity of the form itself was what was so powerful. In other words, as they're turning, you're not seeing all this detail changing and moving. You're just seeing the same form, maybe slightly undulating, and then the moire patterns, which are one of the big, features to exploit with the woven mesh. Just that mathematical regularity, creating moire patterns. I just thought, well, that's the simpler the better, really. Now, these particular ones, it's kind of a new, well, it's not exactly new, but I'm concentrating a little bit more on doing pieces with edges, because my wife Laura was like, you should do more ones with edges. I was always doing just bulbous ones, so they would be kind of the inverted version of this. So they'd be like these spheres with narrower necks, and then these are more like the opposite, where the edge is on the outside.
There's more light and dark, which is so, just the intensity.
Yeah. Well, so part of that is because the mesh itself compresses as you make it narrower. It's a diagonal bias, so I can stretch it out this way, and it basically makes it lighter. Or when I compress it in, there's just more wire and less space between it. But other than that, I don't know what makes it darker. I mean, these are also black, so I don't typically do them black, but I've done them in a lot of different colors. But it's an interesting new thing, because the way they complement each other, or the way they define this negative space, or the way they overlap and go from basically, the white wall, the negative space, to the light looking down the center of the piece, to the edges, and then to the overlapping forms, you get a lot of kind of bang for your buck. And I think you get that with these forms more than you get with the spherical ones, where when they overlap, it's kind of like just the equators of the spheres overlapping. But with these, there's just more of them to overlap, so you get extra effects.
What's so interesting is that every time I look at it, it's different. I mean, they're all spinning, but every time you look at one, and it's the next time you look at it, it's making a different pattern. It doesn't repeat.
Yeah. I did a series of these recently, and I couldn't figure out how to photograph them, and I didn't want to, I didn't really want to set them in a very particular order against my wall to take a picture of them, but I realized what I could do is make sort of a framework that would suspend from the ceiling, and the whole framework could turn, so that as these pieces hung from the framework, and I forget, it was maybe 6 or 7 of them or something, for a commission I could just turn the whole framework, and then as I took pictures of them, they would juxtapose in so many different ways. I could kind of do that with this, but it's a little bit of of an overwrought presentation for just 3, but if I did have maybe 10, I might do that again and they can individually turn, but then the whole installation can turn, and they'll overlap and come apart, and and it just gives a lot more variety, because I feel like it's just one of the fun features of having work. I mean, when it's a grouping, it's like letting that grouping change and morph as it moves around.
I love what the seams do as they move. They have a life of their own. They have their own story.
Somebody likes your seams.
Yeah, oh yeah, the seams. Oh, I love the seams. No. Well, you know what I find interesting? I made a couple of these many years ago, and they're on my front porch, and they just hang on either side of the front porch. And you'll look out, and it's a sunny day, and the sun's shining on these, and there's interesting shadows, and the moire patterns are just electrically jumping all over the place. And you think it's spinning at this crazy rate of speed because the moire patterns are spinning around, and then you look at the seam, and it's just barely even moving. So the seams provide this sort of like timekeeper that you don't expect. And I'm not going to claim responsibility for that. That just happens. So I didn't do it.
The other thing against the white wall, the other thing that's cool is that the line that describes the shape never moves.
Oh, yeah.
Or barely they could be a little bit more uneven. The fact that they're, I make them by hand, and I try to make them even and symmetrical, but I know they're not really going to be, and then the movement just really subtly shows you that they're not exactly even.
The illusion is that the wires moving and the things themselves are not. The outside, you don't see it as all turning. It's just like the inside was turning and the outside wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. It is turning, it's just not changing very much. Hi, Petey.
Sorry, it's just me again. I'm curious what music has anything to do with your imagery, because I just think of you as such a musician through knowing you for so many years but not seeing you for a while. How that is a piece of your aesthetic at all?
Well, it's kind of funny because people will really be amazed that they'll come into my studio and I don't have music going. I'm not listening to a book on tape. It's just quiet with, whatever. Maybe there's a woodpecker hammering on the roof, or maybe there's a car going by or something, and it's just kind of me. There might be music in my head, but I hardly ever really have music playing. Sometimes I do. But the best response I can really come up with is sort of that the way I do this work or this talk or music has always just been improvisational, and I'm not like a bold, daring person, but I'm also really crappy at memorizing anything. So if I was to get up here, if I was to read something, it would be horrible. If I was to memorize something, I'd be like quaking in my boots even more than I am. But so I'd way rather get up and do it like this, and that's the way it was, playing with these guys, playing with Johnny and Chuck and Molly, and just showing up and going, I don't know what we're gonna do, but we'll just keep doing it until something cool happens. And it's just a great way to do it. So it's not really analogous to music per se, but it's more like analogous to an approach that I'd like to keep continuing to try.
Well, I have one more question on this. Aaron, go for it.
Well, you expressed that you kind of found your medium with wire mesh, and I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on, because you were involved in a lot of different mediums beforehand, as I know, ceramics and wood, and also metal, and just if it was beyond just wanting to discover something that you hadn't picked up before, if there was some kind of intrinsic feeling like this was your medium.
Well, you know how I don't know, there's always this struggle between, what we should do and what we actually want to do. And when I would try things, I liked printmaking, and I liked drawing, and I liked this, and I liked that, and I like playing with ceramics. And I'm always kind of trying to just do things my own way, because I wanted to kind of have a certain honesty that comes out of me into the work. And I've always loved being just creative in every way, and even if it's just like fixing something that's broken, I like to just sort of creatively, or maybe even embellish it, you know. And just years would go by, and I would do things, and people would say, "Oh, that's really cool," but I'd already moved on to some other medium, and never really pursued it to any level of excellence. I mean, I don't think. I would just try something, and it's, "Oh, that's fun. Now I'm going to try something else," or I'd dabble with this and I'd dabble with that, and you know, it was a valid critique that people would say, "Why don't you stick with something and really master it?" And I kind of thought, like, that's like I'm having a commitment issue with myself, or you know, I just like, if I really master it, then it's like I'm looking like I'm trying to do my best, and then if people don't think I'm doing my best, then I'm just not that good. So I'd rather just dabble, and nobody can ever critique me for anything. So, but when I started working with this, it just drew me in. So it was just so immediate and tactile, and other people also liked it immediately. So it was like this perfect storm of all these things. Like, I got this material, it's cheap. I mean, I could just like, you know, it's not like I'm investing thousands of dollars in a chunk of marble and then failing to make something. It's like fireplace screen, my hands, you make this thing, it's good, people like it, I got all the ingredients. And so it was pretty seductive, and it was enough to really propel me into wanting to keep working at it. And I also felt like, to a great degree, it was like I got the whole playing field to myself. Nobody else is even doing this. So I got to get, you know, I got to get miles ahead before the next copycat comes along and starts doing this. And that did happen. And, you know, maybe history will be the judge. You know, there's some other really capable wire mesh artists out there. And I'm not even saying that they're all derivative of me. I just feel like when I started working, there just wasn't anybody to even look at. And so it was an exciting time to feel like, you know, like I'm the first person to set foot on the moon, and I got this whole place to myself. So it was just, there were so many ingredients that were seductive enough to just propel me into it. And, you know, and I guess I feel like I'm still discovering so much about it. So it's not like I mastered it and I'm like, you know, resting on my laurels by any degree. I'm just like still working and struggling and discovering. I hope that answers kind of.
That's where I wanted to just ask, oops, I'm sorry, is there somebody over there?
Well, yeah, I have a question. On that same vein, when we did that transformationals course, did you notice a difference in yourself and in your art?
Yeah, so we did, some of us, I'm trying to think if anybody else here was in on that, but there were a group of us, some of the folks that were here at the opening were part of this breathwork course that we did in the 90s, and it cracked me open in a weird way that still happens. But I don't know. I think it affected me personally really deeply, but I don't know if I could say how that has come out in my work. I think it's more like sometimes just like the things that we do to just keep going and not give up on life, you know, are really important, and that obviously affects how we do our work. You know what I mean? But it's another one of these things. It's like that's an autobiographical thing, but I don't really know how to say, you know, that affected my work in one way or the other. But it probably did help encourage me to get to that point where I could say, I'm gonna, you know, experiment more and take more risks with my work. Yeah. And Petey again, or I think.
I just was curious about where do you see yourself going from here? Where do you see your challenges with your medium now?
Well, I'm starting to realize that I'm kind of, I've been beating myself up and I get these kind of aches and pains and I'm thinking I gotta be working smarter. And so, there again, it's like I've sort of self-imposed this rule about, I do everything myself. And every once in a while I'll subcontract. I mean, for example, for many years I've just had somebody else do my powder coating, and I have somebody else do some stainless steel fabrication for certain freestanding pieces, and I think, I kind of know how to do this. I can sort of pass some of this off to somebody else. Maybe I could become kind of the designer and outsource some things, and there's certainly a huge history of artists doing that, even though somehow I still hold it tight, like I'm supposed to do it all myself. I don't know that that's an important, ethic or whatever you'd even call it anymore. I did a commission that I just completed very recently, and it was way out of the ballpark as far as anything I've ever done, and it was installing these huge, basically chicken wire clouds in a hotel atrium. And I needed a whole extra space. I was doing a design that wasn't entirely my design. It was like wrinkly cloud forms. It was on such a vast scale that I couldn't apply many of my normal kind of aesthetic principles to it. And yet, it came out really cool, but more than just what it looks like, it took me through this process. For example, I hired my stepson and another kid. I rented a whole other space that was big enough to do it. I let go of control on so many levels to just allow this thing to happen. And I also committed on a bigger level. Like, this was so far beyond me just tinkering with some little thing at my workbench. It was like I had to tie together all these big pieces, and it kind of represents like, well, that could be a cool way to go. Not actually physically do it all myself, potentially propose bigger installations, not just doing individual kind of, personal collection kind of pieces. And this is still so dear to my heart. This is what I want to do. I just want to tinker in my basement and make this stuff. But I also feel like, well, it could be good for everybody if I, went bigger, but that doesn't mean me personally doing more. It kind of means me being smart about finding other resources to work with. And that's kind of the best way I could describe it, because I don't have a particular form or, format or project in mind, but I'm starting to think, wouldn't it be great to propose bigger things and like open up the parameters of what the material is and not just be so stuck in the material. And again, it's like, people would say, oh, you're the guy who works in chicken wire. No, I never work in chicken wire. I work in fireplace screen. Well, now I have worked in chicken wire. I have to say, yeah, you know what? Chicken wire is actually kind of cool. It's a whole different thing. But now I can say, yes, I have.
So it sounds like you've expanded into collaboration and installation, and that's very broad. And there will be, that's a wonderful way to go.
So who knows? It could be a flash in the pan one-off, or it could be the beginning of a whole new chapter. I don't really know, but usually these things evolve and they start happening. It's not like I sit down and write a proposal, but that could start to happen if I, grow up a little bit and just like, like grown-ups, they do like, doctoral theses, and they do stuff like that, and they write grant proposals, and who knows, maybe I'll get to that point.
Where is the installation?
It's in Grapevine, Texas, at the Hilton Embassy Suites. And it's been up all of, 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah, it's very recent. I'm still kind of reeling from it. Yeah. So it's if you were at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, Grapevine is the little town just on the edge of that airport, and nice hotel too, great people. It was almost like they treated me like family. I was just there with my stepson for a week and kind of had a good old time. Other than having everything go wrong, it was really fun.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for this. It's been wonderful putting the show together and working with you, and this talk has been great. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, guys.